Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. We're delighted you could join us for a webinar with Ard Kramer that will look at is there a risk? And if you have any questions for Ard, please just type them into the questions field there on the control panel, and then at the end of the webinar we will go through your questions one by one. So now let me hand you over to today's presenter, Ard Kramer. Hello Ard.
Good afternoon. I hope you have all a good Valentine's Day. Yeah, I heard you had a great gift today, Dara.
I did. I was telling Ard I just won a facial in a local lottery.
You're a lucky guy today. And I hope my listeners are also very lucky today. So I wish him all a very happy Valentine's Day. My talk is about is there a risks? And my talk is about it's an experience talk. An experience talk with risks in relation to an assignment I had. And it's also a talk about the importance of risk for a tester and for your organization you work in and how inspiring risks can be. But first, let me start introducing myself. I'll put on full screen. There it is. And on this Valentine's Day, I can only show you a big heart. I'm a tester by heart, already since 1997. And besides being a tester by heart, I also like to tell stories at conferences. And I did quite a few conferences last year. And maybe we're going to see each other again this year on certain conferences. But I'm going to start with a little story. It's a little story about a tester who's fast asleep in his bed, and suddenly his test manager comes in. I always get the image like, I don't know if you saw the movie Monsters & Co. Those two guys came into your room, have that image in your head. Suddenly the test manager comes in and wakes you up. And he asks you the question, if we want to go to production right now, what will happen? And the big question is, can you answer that question? And the talk is going to be about that question. And the talk is also going to be about my assignment, as I said before. It was an assignment where I came in as a test manager. And we were doing software development in a waterfall way, which meant that I was responsible for the test phase. We had had to do some analyzing, we do some development, and of course we had to do some testing, which meant that I had to do some reporting. And I thought, what would be the key information I can give to my stakeholders? And I thought the most important thing I can give them is how many product risks are still there, still open, what kind of threats are there. So I said to my testers, I want to have a kind of a stand-up twice a week, and then we're going to talk about features which are going to production, and then we can see if we have still some risks. Because I still think that risk is a common ground between testers and your stakeholders. It's a great input for testing, but also a great input for your organization, how many threats there are before you go into production. So we stood there and I asked my testers, if we want to go to production right now, what will happen? And the response they gave to me was quite surprising. Because the response they gave to me was about test data. No, I don't have any test data yet, can't do some testing, or my environment is not ready, my test environment is not ready, or I'm still waiting for the software. But what I expected was not those kinds of risks, which I call process risks, and I will tell you more about it. I was waiting for product risks, which are really threats when we go into production. And didn't they use any product risks? Yes, of course they did. They use it for prioritization. Before they start testing, they made a kind of a risk analysis to see which risks are more important and what should be tested first. But they didn't use it for reporting. I was quite amazed because there were certified testers, although I don't know exactly what certified means, but at least that meant that they had heard about risk at least once during that course about product risk analysis. But I got away with these kinds of updates about test environment, test data, software like that. So I was thinking, what's wrong? Why don't they tell me about those product risks? And look at yourself. Can you tell me what the consequences are when you are going to production? But first, let me start giving you some explanation of what I think about risks. And I see two kinds of risk, although you see four, but you see two axes. And I want to start with the horizontal axis. You're talking about process or project risks. And mostly they're about people. At least they are depending on people. Something that has to do with something that's out of your control. For example, I told you about the test environment. That means that somebody else had to do something. And mostly when you're talking about process or product risk, you're pointing at someone else. You have to take care of something so I can continue. That's mostly about process risk. Project managers love them. Mostly project managers are really focusing on process risk. Somebody else has to do something. But you also have a vertical axis, and that's about value. It's about product risks and also business risks. They represent value, although it's negative value. And those are threats that you need to have under control. And if you do that, if you really get them under control, you do something positive. And I will tell you more about during this talk, but it's very important to look at those kind of two axes, the process and product risks versus business and product risks. I'm really fond of product and business risks because they are of primary importance. As a tester, we have to know how to deal with these risks because those risks are of primary importance because the development of a product depends on those risks. If you have them under control, those are your responsibility as a tester. So what I'm going to tell you more is these two questions. Why couldn't those testers don't help me with information about product risks? So that's about the context. Why in their context couldn't they tell me more about product risks? And the second question I'm going to answer in this webinar is also why do I find communication about product risks so important? And I even find them inspiring. But first of all, how to communicate with the focus on risk. What was happening in that assignment? Obviously, it was a difficult subject talking about risk, about product risks. And I will give you some examples that you can see them, they saw them as the dark side. Because talking about risk, then you talk about something that can happen in the future. So you can't hold them in your hands. It's quite abstract. Maybe it's even sometimes philosophical, or even hard to imagine. And I can help you with that after a few slides. But I also, in my assignment, I saw that the organization treated risks as the dark side, also in the organization. And I give you some few examples to show you. First of all, if you look at the dark side, it was really a negative approach toward risks. And I'll give you a very simple example. I was organizing a bugathon, and I will tell you more about the bugathon. And I asked the business analyst to join us for the bugathon. It's going to be fun. But he didn't like that attitude. Why looking for something negative? Why looking for bugs or problems or whatever? And he didn't like that attitude, so he didn't want to participate. But I found out that his attitude wasn't really that strange. And just by coincidence, I read in a Dutch newspaper just a few weeks ago, the risk aversity in organizations. And there was a kind of a link, and I'm going to show you in a while a short clip of Daniel Kahneman. And probably you know Daniel Kahneman, he's the writer of the book Thinking Fast and Slow. And he talks in this little clip, he talks about the pre-mortem. And we'll give you a short explanation what he meant with a pre-mortem, and we will recognize it as a tester. A pre-mortem is when you are taking a decision, you're going to think about the future. What will happen after a year if the decision came out to be an extreme big disaster? Then you should be able to write a pre-mortem. What can go wrong? What are all the things that can go wrong the coming year? And in a small clip, he describes how people in organizations look at a pre-mortem. And like I said before, we know pre-mortems, we mostly know them as product risks. And I'm going to start a small clip. It's going to be new for me, so let's see how it works. And here comes the little clip of Daniel Kahneman. Okay, here I'm back again, and you saw some interesting points Daniel Kahneman says. First of all, it's about our popularity. When we talk about risks, we really are taking a chance on our popularity, but it's also that we are of major importance to find that balance between illusion about making a beautiful new product and a realism about what kind of risks there are, what kind of issues there are in the software. So it's our role to make organizations aware of the risk they are taking. That will be our role. So now you understand that the business analyst was kind of negative because he was believing in a kind of an illusion. But it's up to us to give that realism. So I was talking about the negative approach, but there were more reasons that the risks were a part of the dark side at that organization. It also has something to do with the distance to the customer. Because if you have a big distance to your customer, if there is not any feedback loop between the software in production and you as a software development team or a tester, whatever, you won't feel the pain of something that can go wrong into production. You don't see the risks, and you can't use those risks as an input to cover those risks. And I give you a very short example. I was working at an organization with a software architect, and he had a negative experience because a burglar came into his house. So he had to make a phone call to his own insurance company. And what he found out, that the people at the help desk were not using the software the way he thought that they would use it. And that also implied that there were quite some risks how they use it. So you need to have a kind of close distance to your customer, how the people who are using the software. And you also can see the risks. And the third point is also about validation. Because also you're going to need the business to give you input about those risks. But what happened is that those testers who are doing those people from the business who are doing the validation were not really available to help us as testers doing the testing and the validation, the verification, the validation. Because those people who had to do the validation were also the same people who were on the list to be sacked, to be removed from the company. So they were not really helpful to give us input on those risks. And the fourth point is about the motivation of testers. There were some internal testers, but they were not really challenged. They had their own test phase, but they also had a kind of laissez-faire attitude. And there was not a very positive image in the organization. And you get something as a vicious cycle. They were not really motivated, they were not really producing interesting information, kind of laissez-faire attitude, so it was kind of a cycle, not really stimulating. So the conclusion altogether is they didn't have a very positive image, they were not feeling any pain of problems in production, they were not really motivated business stakeholders, no hunting testers. So the conclusion was quite simple. Did they bother about the dark side? No, they didn't. Why bother? Well, when you look at the importance of information, I can refer to this iceberg of ignorance. Because when you pick up your role as a tester and you really are interested in the status of the risks in your software, you can be, as a tester, be the holder of major importance. And as you can see in this iceberg, problems known to the staff 100% is really at the top level, at the down level. Those are the people who are doing the job. They know what can happen. And if you are possible to lift up that iceberg and make it visible what is going on in the software, to make the metaphor complete with the iceberg, maybe you can prevent the Titanic or sinking. So you have to think about that. But it is also it's also about how an organization is organized to see if they are really determined to see the importance of risks. And I will introduce to you a very simple model, and I'm going to teach you some Dutch words. And it's a very simple model, and I just translated one word in the middle. It's the meaning, and it's the meaning of an organization. That's the center. That should be the center. The most important thing in the organization. But what you see around are two circles. It says leefwereld, the world we live in. It's the informal organization. And another circle around it says system world. Mostly it's about processes. And what you see at the direction of thinking is that mostly organizations think outside in. The direction of thinking starts with the system world, goes through the world we live in, and ends at the meaning. And that also means that if you find system and processes more important than the meaning, than the people in your organization, you get something as factory. And when you talk about factories, I always have this image in my head. Charlie Chaplin, who went crazy into a factory. And when I think about testing, I'm not thinking about a factory. Although in some organizations they talk about a test factory. I can't imagine that you can do some testing in a factory. So what happens if also for testers is the process, the system world is more important than the meaning of the organization. It's quite simple. As a tester you have an excuse because you have to follow the process. And if you have to follow the process, you have a reason not to find a problem. If you follow the process, so don't blame me that I didn't find a problem. I followed the process, I did everything I had to do, but I was not really looking at the meaning. Why are we doing this? What's the reason? What's the value of software we are producing? So if you translate that into using the same model and you start thinking inside out, then you are talking about the meaning. Then you see the threats for your product are risks. And if you can cover those, then you are adding value. At least you are preventing negative value. And in the organization, I had my assignment. I also understood that, so they made a major change. They made a major change to Agile Scrum. And if you look at Agile to start with, Agile says something about principles and values. For example, individuals are more important than processes. Yes, that's also what the model says. Individuals, the meaning, why are we doing this, is more important than the system world. But if you have the same people at the steering wheel in the organization, do they really want to change? I think you can answer that question yourself. But if you're looking at Scrum, that also means that there is going to be a team responsibility with the analysts, with developers, with testers to produce potential shippable product. But also means that you're going to have proactive testers. They have to take a proactive role. In refinements, in stand-ups and demos, and reviews, they have to be proactive, which means that they also have to talk about risks. But I didn't talk about risk before, so why should I talk about risk right now? And I can even say there were even new problems because the teams were so organized, they had a limited scope. They didn't have any end-to-end responsibility, which meant that they really produced shippable product for an application. But when you have more application in a complete chain, you're also introducing new risks. And was the business more involved in validation or even participating in teams? No, there weren't. There wasn't anything changed about validation. So did it really change something going to Agile Scrum? No. The only conclusion I can give you, they were doing Scrum, but they were not Agile. The world behind the dark side, I promise you I would tell you more about the importance for me and why even risks are inspiring for me. I'm an optimist. And I even love the world of pessimists, like Daniel Kahneman says. You have to be a kind of a pessimist. But I think that dark side also has some beautiful things, which I will elaborate about. And by the way, if you can recognize this picture, I borrowed it from Pink Floyd, The Dark Side of the Moon, great album. But I cannot tell you more about that dark side behind. That dark side. And that beautiful dark side has some interesting points which make it really inspiring. It has to do something with your motivation. It also has something to do with creativity. Also has something to do with variability. And at the end also has to do with some exploration. And I will tell you more about those 4 points. But because when you want to look at that dark side, and for example you look at motivation, you really have to be motivated to mitigate those risks by testing. And when I'm talking about motivation, I'm mostly talking about intrinsic motivation, something which comes from inside. And I always refer to this book of Daniel Pink, the book Drive. And in this book, he has three main characteristics of intrinsic motivation. And you can see it on the left side in the green boxes. You see, for example, autonomy. Autonomy means that it is your responsibility, and you'll also have the room to take that responsibility to cover the risks in your way. For example, during a test session, then you are in full control, and after the test session, during a debriefing, you can tell everybody what you did, but you are autonomous within a test session. And I will tell you more about test session in a few slides. It's also about mastery, and maybe that's the reason why you're listening and watching right now. You want to improve yourself to become a master of testing. And the third characteristic of intrinsic motivation is purpose. And that refers to the meaning I used before. The meaning in the center of an organization is the reason why you're doing it. You need to have a purpose. And if you now understand that purpose, you also are willing to look at risks. And not only risk at the start of testing, also during testing, and even at the end phase of testing. And I can tell you a little story about that. I was working at a bank, and I had to test an HR system. And everything went all right, and we were almost ready, but I saw a problem. I saw the problem that there was something wrong with authorizations. The authorizations were too limited for the users, and it was a system which had to be rolled out over the complete of the Netherlands. And if you would go to production, that would mean that a lot of people in the banks all over Holland couldn't use the system they were used to using. But we had a very straight deadline, and we had to make that deadline. So I thought, what can we do? I see the risks. It is not covered yet. I know what's going to happen. So what can we do? So what I proposed is, okay, we can go to production, but we need to fill up the help desk completely, because we're going to have a lot of phone calls coming in, and we need to help all those people who are making a phone call to put the authorizations correctly. So that's also about motivation. You really know how the program will be used, how the protocol will be used. So you also can give some advice during your development and even after your development. So that's about motivation. You really have to be motivated to look at those risks. It also is about creativity. Because you have to be creative to get them on the table, because like I told you before, the risks are something that can happen in the future. So you have to use creativity. And I have a very simple exercise how you can use your creativity, and it was really an amazing experience for me too. And I show you some cards of, for example, a hat or a bear. And the exercise was quite simple. Somebody gave me a card, and he says, you got a partner right now, and you go out for a walk for 5 minutes, and you're not allowed to tell your partner what's on the card, but you're allowed to make associations with that card. You can tell everything around it. For a bear, you're not allowed to use the word bear, but also can use the word like wood or forest or a tree or whatever. So we went out for a walk, and I will explain you why walking is quite important. And I started talking, and my partner was not allowed to say anything, and I made all kinds of associations. And after a minute and a half, I thought, I'm done. I told everything I could associate with. But we had to walk for 5 minutes, so I still had a few minutes to go. My partner didn't say anything, so I had to continue. And what happened right then was quite amazing, and I can refer to it as a kind of deep thinking. Because what happened is, after that minute and a half, I really found a really deep pool of all kinds of very interesting associations, and I could go on and on for minutes. And it was really an astonishing experience how you can use your creativity. But you have to do it silently. That's quite interesting. I also said that walking is quite important, because you think better if you walk. If my wife wants to have a good conversation with me, she says, come on, let's go for a walk. I'm going to talk about something. And even a duck, and I used this picture before in some other presentation, is that you see Scrooge's duck, and he has a problem. And he's walking around in his war room, and he has a good reason for walking around, because if you walk around, you think better, you think more deeply. So thinking about creativity is also do it silently. Mostly when we have brainstorm sessions, we do it out loud. It's better to do it silently. Write something on your post-its for a few minutes, for at least 4 or 5 minutes, and then collect all those ideas together. And then you can have some interference. And mostly then you need another tool. You're going to need this one. This is a coffee machine, which is quite important also for a tester, because then you can talk to people and you can be inspired by hearing stories from other people. And with all this information, you really can make a great risk analysis, because a risk analysis is about creativity, making connection between dots, all those informations which you have found which seem unrelated. And then if you have all those dots connected, you can see which risks you are going to cover or not going to cover, because they're not important enough, or whatever reason you can find why you have to cover certain risk and certain risk you don't have to cover. That's about creativity. And now about falsifiability. Falsifiability is about the black swan, and it's a great book of Nicholas Taub, and the book says quite simple about the black swan, because nobody believed there was a black swan, because the world only knew white swans. So they said, no, a black swan, that's impossible to find a black swan. Until they went to New Zealand and they found black swans. And that is falsifiability. It's about looking for something to see if it's there. You don't know if it's there, about uncertainty. Mostly we're talking about validation and verification. And validation is it the right product built? And verification is it built right? But you also have to really have to focus on falsifiability. It's your task as a tester to find proof that the risk is there. And if you found a risk, then you found a problem. And that's also what I like about testing, because falsifiability also comes from science. Because in science, they like to prove a theory. But you can't prove a theory. You only can find proof that is not correct. And until you didn't find any proof that it isn't correct, then this theory stands. That's also what you have to do as a tester. As a tester, you have to try every possibility. And if you can't find any evidence, then probably there is no risk. That's about falsifiability. And when you do a really good falsifiability, you have to do some exploration. Because also exploration is something that you do in science. Explore to find some proof. And it's also, as a tester, you have to do all kinds of things nobody else does. And if people say that won't happen, it can happen. If you don't try, you don't know. So try and see if you can find some proof. And if you use that creativity, I talked before, the sky is the limit. And doing exploration, obviously, I will refer to exploratory testing. And when I'm talking about exploratory testing, I also use a metaphor. The metaphor I use during exploratory testing, and your screen is not broken, it's looking looking for a black hat in a dark room, and you don't know if it's there. And of course, during the exploration, you get to know the room better and better, bit by bit, or maybe bite by bite. But you never know where that cat can jump up. So if you're using your creativity, you really are motivated. You are really trying to falsify your software, falsify the risks, and doing the exploration. I think then you're also capable of thinking like an entrepreneur. You're really thinking out of the meaning of your organization and how you can contribute to your organization in such a way that you not only call it entrepreneurship, I would call it testerpreneurship. You as a tester know how the organization works and what's really important. Then you can become a testerpreneur. Oh yeah, I was talking about my assignment. Let's go back to that one, because we were doing Agile Scrum, which meant I got a new role as a test facilitator, which meant that I had to advocate for product risks. And they were even more important, like I told you before, because we had some end-to-end risks. So what I tried to do is try to help the teams to improve themselves. So first of all, what I did, I asked them for sprint reports. What kind of dependencies do we see in the end-to-end chain? And I received the sprint reports from my testers in the teams. They still came up with a lot of process risks. I was not able to test because we didn't have time enough, or the test data was not correct. And I gave him feedback. You have to tell me about product risks. What can happen if you go to production right now? And besides that, besides those sprint reports, I'm also trying to introduce some fun things. And I told you about the Buckathon. And I organized the Buckathon, which meant that there were 10 teams of 3 people who were allowed for 2 hours to do some testing on an almost ready system. And it was really fun. We did it for 2 hours with some pizzas, and I really found some quite interesting bugs, interesting problems that saw some risks. And the biggest compliment I received that some member of the team said, I never knew that testing was so much fun. But I also use it as a way of introducing session-based testing, because session-based testing is about a certain time limit. I gave them 2 hours to do a Buckathon. And also, if you want to do a good test session, you need charters. In this case, we used use cases. But why couldn't you use risks as a charter? I see that risk, and I'm going to take 2 hours to find out if that risk is still applicable. So that was my way of introducing exploratory testing and also session-based test management. Another way of making it IT fun or making testing fun is using visualization. And I was talking to you about a bank. It was another assignment, and we had to test an HR system. And we had to think all kinds of risks what can happen in the HR system. HR system is about human resources, it's about people. And we had to think all kinds of strange things that can happen in an HR system. So we found out if you look at a soap, for example, The Bold and the Beautiful, you can find very interesting risks what can happen to your system. For example, what happens in The Bold and the Beautiful, they marry 5 times with different people, or maybe sometimes with the same people. Sometimes they disappear out of the soap and come back as if they were dead. Is that possible in a system? Can you test a system like that somebody is removed from the system as if he were dead and comes back? How many children can you put into the system? So if you use a soap as kind of a visualization, you really get inspired to see more risks and how you want to cover them. And I also can refer to this book. It's about Peak, How to Master Almost Everything. And if you want to know more about visualization, read this book. How will you improve yourself with mental images? It's a really great book. And the last example I can give you is also about a wheel of misfortune. And I came up with this idea because a great tester I know, Rolf van Steenbergen, is a great tester in exploratory testing. And he made a mind map of risks, and he used that mind map as a kind of a backlog to see what risks are applicable in a certain feature. So I thought, why, if you use a mind map, why couldn't you use, for example, the wheel of misfortune, a translation from the mind map to a wheel of misfortune, and also a kind of a way to visualize risks. So I'm almost at the end of my webinar. But I can't help that I have to end with a quote of a philosopher, because I call myself a polysolver. So I have to end with a quote of a great philosopher. He who doesn't know may still have true ideas about what he does not know. That's all about. That is what we testers are all about. And it's leading for me as a tester to look for the unknown, because it's going to be there. So let's end up with a small wrap up. Because if you're talking about risk, is there a risk? Risks can be used as a common language. It helps to talk to your stakeholders. It helps you to mitigate, not only by testing, but also by other creative ways, as I told you before, how you can use that. And it's also looking at the bright side of pessimism. Can you help your organization by avoiding negative value? It can also be help to be very motivating. And you have to falsify. And that's a tough road if you do some falsification, because you have to find out proof that something works. Find proof that something works is quite easy, but finding proof that it's not working or not good enough, that can be very tough. And you must be willing to make that contribution. You really must be motivated to do that. And if you do that with all your enthusiasm that you have, you can show people the beauty of risks. And I want to end there. I want to thank you very much for listening and watching my webinar. And if there's still some questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Ard, for that presentation. And let me just open my screen here again. Okay, so before we look at your questions, I just want to let you know that we have an upcoming conference this 27th and 28th of February in London. It's called UK Star, and we have a lot of really great speakers there with keynotes, tutorials, track sessions, conversation tracks, workshops. So if you want to find out about this conference, just head over to ukstar.eurostarsoftwaretesting.com. And if you're thinking of going as a group, we have a group discount where you can get 4 tickets for the price of 3. And you'll find out all that information out over on the UK Star website. We have a webinar tomorrow with Dirk-Jan de Groot, and he will be looking at creating agile test strategies for larger enterprises. And next month we have a webinar with Mark Tomlinson, and he'll be looking at performance in a DevOps world. And to register for these webinars, just head over to the Huddle website and click on the upcoming webinars tab. Okay, so let's have a look and see what questions we have there. And a few people here just saying thank you very much, Ard. And Rainier says, amazing presentation. Thanks a lot for that. US says a great presentation. And so if you have any questions at all, please type them now, and we will go through them. And I shared a link with you all as well for the video. I know that some of you may not have been able to see the video properly, so I shared a link to that. But also, this webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to view that very shortly. I'll send you all on the link. And there doesn't seem to be any questions coming in. There's a lot of people saying thanks for the presentation, and thank you all to our attendees for coming along, and thank you to Ard for taking the time out today on Valentine's Day. I'm sure your wife was very pleased that you didn't take her on a date, and instead you decided to join all of us for a testing webinar.
You don't know, maybe she's sitting beside me. No, she isn't.
Okay, well, there doesn't seem to be any questions, and there's a lot of people just saying thank you very much. And I think one person's after coming in here and says, I'd like to know how do we tackle risks that cannot be avoided, such as test environment not being ready?
That's a great question, because we mostly are dealing with those kinds of questions. Those are what I call process risks, and then you really have a kind of a facilitator really taking care of that. And when you have to have that in control before you start testing. That's an easy answer. I can give you that one, but you have to really be in control. So you can have full focus. That means that you have to take care that somebody in your project is there to take care of the test environment. But also, if you see, for example, slow or not very big product risks, why don't you, maybe you can test something in production even. You have to consider that, because if you think with your organization, you know what kind of deadlines you have to take all kinds of possibilities into account. But first of all, yes, if your organization is risk aware, they also take care of the process risks of the project risks. So they have to take care of a good test environment.
I have another question here that asks, what methods do you use to identify risks? A method which is really a great method, and it's not really from me, but I really like the idea. Something like the same like the pre-mortem is what we call the nightmare game. And Rob van Steenbergen, who I also referred to during my talk, he uses the nightmare game. And the nightmare game is quite simple. Think about going to production, and the next day you're sitting at your breakfast table and you really open your paper. And what would be the worst nightmare in that paper about your project? What went wrong that night going to production? And if you think about that nightmare, then you really have a good way of analyzing your risks.
So that's a method you can use, and I love it very much. But mostly the question I'm using, what are you worried about? And mostly people start talking. But also you have to kind of brainstorm, what I refer to in my talk, also kind of brainstorm ideas to get those risks on the table.
I have another question that asks, is there a way to classify or categorize risks in advance?
Yeah, mostly what I didn't talk about also is about likelihood and things like that, about risks. So you have to classify them. So how big chance is there going to be that the risk is going to happen? And if you can classify them, mostly you start with the most important risks, first of all, to test them. And also you have to think about testability. Can you test those risks? Those are also quite important questions. Mostly what you can do is categorize them also with the people in your room. If you found, like I told you before, like kind of the game, the pre-mortem game, if you put all the risks on the table, for example in post-its, really categorize them and put them into an order and really visualize that, have a table in your mind, put all the post-its on it and categorize those post-its, and from left to right, on the left side, you really have the very important risks you want to cover, like a category, and you go to the right and those are the less important risks. So you start on the left side and you start testing step by step, and that's as long as you have the time, because also it's very important. You can stop testing at any time. But if you stop testing at any time, you must be aware of what are the risks are still on that table you have to cover, or do you want them to cover, or let the business decide if they want to take that risk. So categorize them, for example, with post-its from the most important risk to the less important risk, from left to right, and start on the left side, start testing them. And if you don't have any time, you can show them right away which risks are still on the table. Quite easy, just visualize it.
How generic can those categories be? Are they always have to be project specific, or do they always have to be project specific? I mean,
they don't have to be project specific. They have to be product specific. That's a hard word. It has to be focused also on the product. I read a really great blog, also it was in Dutch, about regression testing. Mostly, for example, also in regression testing, you should look at the system, at the product. What can go wrong with that problem, with that product, with that system, if something is changed? That means that you don't have to use the same regression test over and over again, but look at what is changed into the system, into the product. And if something is changed of high importance, like a primary process, test it in a kind of regression test. I also plead, don't do it only automated, even it's more important to do it exploratory. Explore that part of the software which can be changed and can be a subject of regression, but also start looking at what kind of risks is there going to be if something goes wrong in that primary system, the primary function of the system. So you have to look at the product.
how do you highlight risks while there's more than one project running in parallel that might affect one another?
Mostly what you have to do, for example, I do it in an Agile Scrum situation, you have to create a Scrum of Scrums. Put those Scrum Master or testers in a team together and let them make a kind of a product backlog or a product board which can happen into the system. And together you have to have contact, you have to communicate. That's also why I said about creativity, that a coffee machine is so incredibly important, because there you can meet each other and talk about, oh, this is going to happen in my system. What does it do with your system? What can happen? Oh, but if I receive another interface from you, that can change something in my system. So what you even can do is put yourself into what I said also about risks, is that certain people into a chain can sit next to each other and even put on a risk on a paper and pass it on to somebody else and says, I see this risk, is that also applying to you? Is that a risk for you? And you can give it to each other and see if the risk is going over the complete chain, and then you can work together. You have to put your heads together to communicate about risks. That is the most important thing. It's about communication.
Product risks identification has to involve resources other than testing. How can test resources know what's likely to go wrong? Even if tester can identify they are unlikely to be able to determine impact and probability.
Then you need the business. That's also why I'm talking, during my assignment, we didn't have much input coming from the business. Because like people, for example, go to people who are working on a help desk. They know, they receive questions, what can go wrong into the system. Maybe what's kind of vulnerable in the system. They can give you input. So you need a lot of people. That's also why you should walk around as a tester. Go to the help desk. Listen to them sitting next to them for half a day. See what kind of calls coming in. And go to the business. Go to your product owner. Go to the business who are using, maybe making new products. People who are thinking about a product, they are creating an illusion. And you have to ask them, if something goes wrong, what do you expect? What worries you? What shouldn't go wrong? What costs a lot of money if it goes wrong? Those are the questions you should ask them. So that means that as a tester, you're like kind of spin in the web, spider in the web, that you go to other people and ask them all kinds of questions. That's also why I like philosophy, and because like a philosopher, you're allowed to ask questions. The question is going to be the main asset you have before you start testing. What can go wrong? What do you see? What will happen? Ask a developer, ask the business, ask a stakeholder, ask everybody what can go wrong. And if you put them together, categorize them and start with the highest risks first.
Can tests be prioritized based on risks? And if yes, is there an automated way to do that?
An automated way to do that? Was that your question, Dara?
The question was, can tests be prioritized based on risks? And if yes, that they can, is there an automated way to do that? So I guess, is there an automated way to prioritize the risks?
Yes, you can do that, but the difficult thing about risks, like I told in the webinar, is that it's going to be something that can happen in the future. So something that's going to happen in the future is hard to optimize, I think. And also the question was, yes, risk should be leading in what you're going to test, because a risk is a threat. It's going to be, if a risk is going to be there in production, you're going to have negative value. For example, your website won't be available, so you can't sell anything to your customers. Which means if you use the risks as a way to prioritize your testing, always start with the highest risk. What is the major risk that can go wrong? Falsify that risk. Try to find some proof if that risk is there. If you find any proof, write a report and says, I tried everything I could do within the given time and in the given knowledge I have. I couldn't find any evidence that the risk is there. And then if you have prioritized those risks during your testing, and if you've done the highest priorities and your time is up, what you can say to your stakeholder, I've tested, for example, those 5 most important risks. I think I've covered them. I haven't seen any big problems. I still have some risks left. Stakeholder, are you willing to take those risks going to production? If you're not willing to take that risks, we have to do some more testing, or maybe take some other ways of covering that, of mitigating that risks. But yes, risks should be there as a prioritization for your tests.
Did you ever experience in a project that there was no risk or very low risks? And if yes, would you advise to not test?
Yep, that's a very good, that can be quite a good advice. It can be, for example, just a minor change into a system. Mostly what you see also during continuous integration or delivery, that sometimes just change the content of a table. And yeah, if the content of a table changes, you also can re-change it again if it's really a problem. So you can say, oh, you changed some, for example, a typo or things like that. That's a very low risk. If it goes wrong, we can really change it right away. So yes, you can go to production without testing. But you have to be able to tell what kind of risks, how low, even they are very low, you must be able to tell the stakeholder they're going to be minor risks. I can give you the advice, you can take those risks, you can go to production, and if they happen, and that's also about your motivation, you know what you can do if they happen. For example, we can change it within 5 minutes. We can rerun the software into production and it's going to be changed in the right way. So not only think about, no, you don't have to test, but also think about how you can mitigate it when it happens into production. And that's also about creativity. That's fun.
Is assessing risks the responsibility of the whole team or just the testers?
It's the responsibility of the whole team, because it's also about testability. And the whole team should be able to think, and that's also a role as a tester. That's why a tester should be proactive. He should ask questions during, for example, a refinement. We're going to make this. It's a big illusion, it's a beautiful illusion we're going to make. But what can go wrong if we make that? How difficult it is, developer, how difficult is it going to be to make that code, to make this illusion, to make this new product? And he says, oh, it's going to be very difficult. And he says, oh, we have a problem. We have to test it, because if it's difficult, something can go wrong. And then we should test it, because it's a risk. You can program it in the wrong way, and then we have a problem. So, in fact, if you do it right as a tester, and for example, you're not able to visit a refinement, then somebody else should ask the same question. Who's going to be the advocate of the risk? Who's going to pop up the question, what happened if it goes wrong? It should be a team responsibility.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that have come through for now, Ard. So we might wrap it up there at that. And just wanted to say thank you very much again for taking time out today to talk to us about risks. And thank you to all of our attendees for coming along and all of your questions. And please come back again tomorrow for the webinar with Dirk-Jan de Groot, looking at the agile strategies for larger enterprises. And that's it from us here today. So thank you all and enjoy your Valentine's Day.